Welcome to Philoxenia. We are not in Vienna, unfortunately, today, my guest and I, because Omicron prevents us to have to travel easily. But we are quite happy to be together in this living room. So welcome, Tariq Ali.
Thank you, Tessa. I'm more than happy to be in your lovely living room.
It's maybe we were just talking about this. Hopefully soon possible that we'll all be traveling freely and sit with lots of people. But I am very happy that we can do this live now and that we have people on Facebook and on Zoom watching us. So welcome to everyone and let's get started. Tariq Ali is a very well-known figure for years as a leftist commentator, political activist, author, meddling in international affairs. He comes from Lahore, from Pakistan originally, is British and lives not far from me here now on Camden Square, we just discussed, where Amy Winehouse also lived before she unfortunately died much too early. You have just written a book. Tariq, of course, has written a lot of books. One we want to discuss today, and this is this one. It's called The 40-Year War in Afghanistan, a Chronicle Foretold. As you can imagine, Tariq Ali was not a supporter of the intervention of Western forces, but also not of Eastern forces ever to go into Afghanistan. And we want to talk about this a little bit now. I also want to say that we will have a conversation between us now for a bit, and then we are very happy to have questions from the virtual floor. So please think of questions if you have any. Don't be shy. Tariq will be happy to answer.
Please ask whatever you wish.
So today I was actually watching in the House of Commons the debate on Russia and the threat of war in the Ukraine. And it was quite interesting to see with what sophistication the parliamentarians were discussing what would be the right thing to do now. Obviously, the UK is not a pacifist country, and it's also not very close to Russia. It is sort of a global power and a military power and owns nuclear weapons. And I was thinking, nobody said there that Britain should put troops on the ground. And I was thinking of you, and I was thinking, the age of intervention, putting boots on the ground anywhere, but also not in Europe, even in a threat of war like now. Is this the consequence of all the doomed interventions we have seen, especially the one in Afghanistan?
Probably to a certain extent, Tessa. But before elaborating on that, I don't think Britain is a global power on its own. I think Britain is very much a subordinate power to the United States. In terms of foreign policy, its foreign policy has been subordinated to that of the United States for a very long time, though there were big rifts in the Foreign Office on the Iraq War. But by and large, they go along with anything that the State Department wants. It's not a state, Britain, which you can say is a sovereign state. It is 50-50. It cannot do anything militarily without the permission of the United States. I think we have to be aware of that and not sort of fall into the trap of building Britain up as an independent power. It isn't. This whole notion that they would be independent if they left Europe, I pointed out at the time, though I'm not a great fan of the EU's, that this is nonsense. Because inside or outside the EU, Britain is subordinate to the United States. So if the United States decided it wanted feet on the ground and it wanted to provoke a military clash with Russia and wanted some British troops, they would be sent. But Biden is not for that, as we know. So what will happen in the Ukraine, I think, will be determined by the priorities of the United States. And at the moment, they are difficult to work out. Putin's position is clear. You promised when the Soviet Union collapsed and dissolved, you promised Shevardnadze and Gorbachev that there would be no NATO expansion eastwards. You broke that promise, to which the Americans say it was a verbal thing, maybe you misunderstood. And that sort of reminds one that it's to give up everything just like that without a formal treaty was very foolish of Gorbachev. He now realizes it.
Gorbachev didn't really know what he was doing, what he set in motion with everything, but also with the future.
But anyway, we can come back to the Ukraine. In Afghanistan, it's a disaster story.
Yeah.
First, the Soviet intervention to try and save an unpopular minority left-wing government who started fighting each other and started killing each other. And so the Russians went very reluctantly, but at the time they went in December 79, I think it was the last week in December, I wrote an article then, which made me very unpopular on the left, saying this is going to be a disaster. They'll be trapped. It's not going to be a quick thing, just change the leader and come out. And more importantly, I said, the entry of Soviet troops into Afghanistan is going to give all the reactionary forces, all the mullahs in Afghanistan, the opportunity to unite to drive out not the communists, but the atheists. Yeah. And the Americans are going to come in and use it.
But hold on, because what I thought was really interesting when I read your essays also from the earlier years, and, you know, in 79, you know, the Soviets actually came, but I read, and I didn't know that Trotsky had already thought. I saw a quote there where Trotsky said, very, very early on as a Soviet commissioner, that one should go in, conquer the world via Kabul. And that I thought was interesting, because did they actually think, was it only him, or was there a Soviet wing that would think one should have, you know, a permanent revolution, not only in European lands, but also expanded?
It's very interesting that actually I found that in, I think it's dated 1922, just after the Civil War. And it's a letter that was sent privately to Lenin and the Politburo. And Trotsky said, given that for the time being, Europe appears lost, and we have suffered setback after setback in Europe, how could we use the Red Army to shift the balance of forces in Europe? And one way to do it is to hit the British Empire at its weakest. And his plan, it never went beyond a paper discussion, was to create a Soviet Asian army of 30,000 volunteers to go and kick the British out of India. That, he said, will be the biggest blow we can give the British Empire, and that will change the balance of forces. So they were thinking like this, but they did believe in the world revolution. And so there were many discussions on China, India, in the Communist International at the time. But this intervention, carried out by Brezhnev, with Andropov, the head of the intelligence, KGB, was opposed to it. He had been Soviet ambassador in Hungary in 1956, and he had become very nervous of interventions. Yeah. So he was opposed to it, but still, they went in, and what happened, I hate to say this, but I had predicted
it.
But
why do you think the Soviets went? Because it was the first time that they intervened outside of
Eastern Europe. Yeah. I think there was this, it was a pretty bankrupt leadership, politically bankrupt, visionless, unlike the Chinese, by the way. And they thought the only thing they can do is mimic the United States. So the Americans do this all over the world, invade countries. Why shouldn't we? There's an element of that also in the debate on the Ukraine that is going on now. But they decided to do it because they said, if Afghanistan falls and the Americans take it up, it's a defeat for us. And so this is the way they decided to do it, that the people they were supporting had got out of control. It was to discipline them that they went in and then got caught up in the war. And in the second essay in this volume is an interview, I quote, with Brzezinski by the Le Nouvel Observateur, where Brzezinski admits that we had been waiting for this. It was a bear trap, and the Russians stepped in, and we said, this is where we are going to take our revenge for Vietnam. And so the Paris journalist asks him, but look what the result has been. The interview was after 9/11. Well, look what the result has been, the rise of jihadi groups. You started it off by linking with these people to fight the Russians, encouraging them. And Brzezinski's reply is, what are a few jumped up Muslims compared to the fall of the Soviet Union?
Well, they didn't understand what beast was created in all this. But what I still wonder also, because you come basically from across the border, Lahore and all this region has struggled so much to get its own political system that functions, whatever it is. You know, let's not even hope for democracy. Those kind of things. But so Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion was, you know, you had a Shah system, you had tribes, very strong tribal system, and they were mostly corrupt. I mean, can we compare this a little bit with the Iran situation, that there was sort of foreign powers trying to meddle and support various factions, and or was that not as strong, and people were just also generally not capable of having a functioning system and making and feed their population? Because Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion was extremely poor also.
It was always poor, but there was no mass starvation. They looked after people. And the tribal system enabled them to look after their tribes. And the largest tribes were the Pashtun tribes. And these tribes in the 18th century were, you know, I've compared them to the Scottish Highlanders, who were tribesmen in the Highlands of Scotland. And the British government of the day, during the German kings who were imported to run the monarchy, decided that these Highlanders were a problem because they refused to accept the new system that was being made, and they were rebellious. So they went and wiped them out. And basically, there have been some amazing books written about it. The Highland, what they call the Highland clearances, clear them out. And large numbers of these Highlanders from Scotland ended up in Canada, where they are quite a dominant force, their heirs. That couldn't be done with Afghanistan because they were very conscious of where they came from. And these 18th century tribes in Afghanistan, some of them were very literary, very cultured. They wrote, they sang, they painted. So it wasn't a tribes in the sense of what many people in the West think of tribes. You know, they were tribal in the structures, but they were also incredibly cultured, and they were ferocious in defending their sovereignty. So even when the Indians, before the British, the Mughal kings intervened to try and bring them down, they fought back against the Mughals and defeated them on a number of occasions. So it was in this struggle for a primitive sovereignty, let's call it that Afghanistan grew. And it was always a federation of tribes whose leaders would decide who is to be king. And one of the kings, and this is, you know, quite astonishing, Amanullah, who became king in, I think, in 1919, he looked at two countries. One was Turkey after the First World War and Kemal Atatürk's reformist modernization, and the other was the Soviet Union and Lenin. So he wrote letters, Soviets sent envoys, the Turks sent envoys, and the first constitution of Afghanistan that was prepared in 1919 or early 20 gave women the right to vote. And the right to equality even, because the king's wife, Queen Soraya, was an early feminist, quite inspired by the suffragettes in Britain and the struggles there. So she insisted on it. And this was in the constitution. But before that constitution could be implemented, the British moved in. They thought the king was too radical. He was flirting with the Russians and with the Turks. And they toppled him. And how they toppled him was by getting together the most reactionary tribal and religious elements, putting out pictures of the queen, fake pictures, Queen Soraya in a swimming suit on the beach. She'd never been. Circulating them to peasants saying, look, this is your queen, she's worse than a prostitute. So a lot of the propaganda that was used again, saying, look what the Russians are doing, they're educating the girls in all the cities, they're saying women can be pilots, women can be doctors. From that point of view, the Soviet presence in the cities actually was not bad. I have to say that.
But also the British Empire wouldn't have had anything against women being you know, part of public life. I mean, both would have had a modernist influence on tribal structures, I guess.
Well, the British didn't do that during their first interventions. The whole way the British governed India and countries nearby was by keeping the existing social structures and cultural structures going. So they removed the worst things in India, the women burning themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres, and saying that, and saying it was voluntary, the family pressure, saying it's voluntary. That stopped. Lord Bentinck, when he was viceroy in 1838, stopped that. Yeah. But that's all. The caste system, don't touch it.
But they brought English and cricket, as we know. That's the
British.
They brought English as a language and cricket as main entertainment.
But hang on, cricket we can discuss some other time. But the way they brought in English, it was one of the great historians of Britain, Lord Macaulay, who drafted the Minute on Education from the beginning. In 1858, after the big uprising in India, they said, we will not educate the population as a whole. We will educate a tiny elite. And I can't remember the exact words used, but it was, which is, learns English, works for us, and in every other way we make it English. But this has to be an elite that collaborates with us, full stop.
Yeah.
And so it was tiny. When the British left India after 150 years, 90% of the population was illiterate.
But can we compare this to Afghanistan? Because I was actually astonished to see also the numbers of, there were 3 wars, right, that the British had in Afghanistan. One in 1839 to 42, one in 1878 to 80, and then the third one in 1919.
Yeah.
And so if you think of this incredible also energy spent on something like the British Empire spent on this was, what did the British Empire get out of Afghanistan?
They were nervous that the Tsarist Empire had their eyes on Afghanistan. It's what the British ideologues, imperialist ideologues, called the Great Game. Who will take Afghanistan, Russia or the Tsarist Russia or Imperial England, Imperial Britain. And each thought the other was playing games. So both were maneuvering. In fact, the fact is neither of them were actually able to take it. The British suffered heavy defeats in Afghanistan, and that should have given them what they finally got was they divided the Pashtun people. The British did that to reduce the strength of the Pashtun tribes. They built over 1,000 kilometers border, the Durand Line, which was meant to come to an end, I think, in the 90s. And of course, it never did. But it did create a real nationalist anger amongst Pashtuns on both sides of the border. Because the border existed like this. They drew their barbed wire here. On each side of the barbed wire, it's the same village, the same people, relations. So they could never police that border. People just ignored the barbed wire or cut it and crossed every day. You know, they didn't care. They said, okay, it will take them a long time to come this way again, to put the barbed wire back. It's only recently, since 9/11, that the border has become quite hard in many ways, and lots of observation posts, etc. So they wrecked Afghanistan and the Pashtun tribes by dividing them. And the Pashtuns, the British took, made Peshawar their capital, and the Northwest Frontier Province in British India was created. Afghanistan, whatever government you had, never accepted that division. So there was, from the point of view of every Afghan government, tension on the Durand Line, the border. We don't like it on it. And that created huge problems between the two countries, regardless of Islam and anything else. And, you know, the Pashtun tribes in Pakistan, of course, they have links with the Pashtun tribes in Afghanistan.
No, why shouldn't they have? But it's one of the big responsibilities now of modern Britain, and of course it's not happening, but to work through all these things that the British Empire has done to these regions by, for example, drawing borders that certainly were not drawn by the people who lived there.
No.
So that would be one for the next talk we'll have soon.
Well, we don't know whether I can't imagine any Pakistani government influenced by the military ever dissolving this border. It happens, you know, there's nothing much people can do about it. I mean, if Pakistan's army is what, the 9th or 10th largest in the world, the Afghans can't defeat it. And the Taliban government before, even that government had tensions. They were very dependent on Pakistan, but they had tensions with them. They thought Pakistan was a louche state. They look there. Men wear shorts when they are playing football, and whereas in Afghanistan the shorts have to be nearly covering the knee, the whole leg. All this stuff was going on, and behind it was a refusal, even of the Taliban, to accept easily everything that Pakistan was saying, and that will carry on. I'm predicting that. That will carry on. The Pakistan army thinks they've won a big victory, and in a way they have. India is washed out, no longer playing any part in Afghanistan. The United States and NATO have suffered a huge defeat, political and ideological more than military. The puppet army they created collapsed within 7 days. But a lot of problems remain.
Yeah, of course. But I thought it was very, very interesting in your essay where you describe how the Taliban came about, and because that's something, you know, now it's such a topical issue again, what the Taliban is and what it wants and how it ticks. But at the time, the first generation, you describe how you that a different type of religious student was created in these radical madrasas in Pakistan.
Yeah, it was. And the thing, what happened was that once the Russians went in and the Americans started backing religious groups and creating religious groups through the Pakistani army, large numbers of refugees came into Pakistan, really a few million. And of course, the older poor people, I mean, the rich, the elite, some of them did, but they didn't live in the camps. So camp life meant that as children were born and grew up, schools were created for them. And in these schools, they taught a very limited religious curriculum. I mean, the alphabet even, what was it? I've forgotten it now. Kaf, K, is for Kalashnikov. Mm-hmm. So it was militarized religion that was created in these schools for children. And the aim was clear. They were being trained to go and fight and sort of liberate their country, supposedly. And I remember when my father died in 95 or 96, the chief minister of this province, who was a family friend, came to condole. And I hadn't seen him for a long, long time. And he patted me on the head and said, "Tariq, do you know what's going on in my province?" He said, "We are creating monsters. We have put in dragon seeds and the dragons will soon become visible." I said, he said, "Do you know how many madrasas, religious schools there are? Mm-hmm. Do you know what they're going to produce?" Well, I said, "No, tell me." I mean, I did have an idea, but he gave me a very, very, he said, "I'm fed up of telling them, our army and our government, don't do this because it will wreck the region." But they did. And ultimately, Taliban, the word itself means student. So ultimately, they went in with the support of the Pakistan army and ended the civil war between the people who later became the Northern Alliance. The Taliban took over. Now, horrific though their regime was in many respects, one thing they did do was really clamp down hard
on the corruption,
on
the existing one.
Yeah.
Before they established their own.
Exactly. Yeah. So they did that.
But you know what? There is you quote Ahmed Rashid, whose books I always like to read also, on this
Taliban.
On this book, Taliban, Islam, Oil, and the Great Game in Central Asia. And I thought it was really interesting because it sort of showed how these boys who were sent to these madrasas, they were not like the mujahideen, the traditional type of religious students, as you just said. Yeah? And I thought it was such a good description, how he says that they had also no connection anymore because they were grown up, they grew up during the war. Yeah? And so they had no connections to what their tribe was, who the elders were, what the wisdom was, and how sort of things worked in the society. And this is one I find really good explanation that you give and that Rashid gave on how to understand how the destruction of
this
the
is absolutely true. And what the chief minister also said to me is that what is going to happen is these kids are going to go back, and it's already, we see it, some of them are already back and are taking over the tribal structures. And he was, of course, a very snobbish guy himself, a big Pashtun landowner. And he said, whereas till now, we people, cultured, educated, have kept the tribes under control, automatically the leadership of the tribes comes with us. That is going to change. And that is what you have to fear. And of course, he was proved absolutely right on that. But now 20 years of NATO occupation, no fundamental change because the Northern Alliance did nothing. In the few cities, NGOs tried to educate some young girls, good. But on the key issues of rebuilding some infrastructure, you know, it used to really make me weep when I used to hear stories from Afghanistan. People used to say to me, Afghans, for $5,000, we can build a little house for a family of 4 or 5, with $8,000 for a family of 9 or 10, very clean, with sanitation, but we will use mud bricks. That's why it's cheap, like our houses used to be built. But no one is keen on that. So the neoliberalism, which the NATO countries had imposed at home, prevented them from doing anything beneficial. Can you imagine? From $5,000 to $10,000 a house, perfectly decent. So the slums grew, the elite pocketed a lot of the money which was being sent and built these huge mansions in the center of Kabul, wrecking the personality of the city. That is what happened. So it's been a disaster. But Tessa, what I was going to say is the thing that not puzzles me, but intrigues me, is what is going to happen to this new Taliban leadership, which grew up over 20 years. But sometimes they wear traditional clothes. But the ones who were living in Dubai and the Gulf states used to wear Armani suits, ties, mobile phones, living in the modern world in many ways. And they were the ones who would talk to the West, whereas the ones who wore traditional clothes kept the movement alive and had contacts regularly with Pakistan and also with China. So how this is going to pan out, I don't know. I mean, as you probably know, yesterday in Oslo doesn't have a very good record for accords, but never mind, they try.
Well, they try at least, And I thought to bring together for, you know, that's not a recognition of the Taliban, but to bring together to try to influence, to make the situation of women a little bit more maybe possible.
I think they're not being as brutal to the women as they were before. There are incidents, but nothing on the scale on which they did it. I mean, they are all very aware of that. So I mean, you know, I know the situation well, and I will say this, that the condition of women throughout South Asia is horrific, particularly Pakistan and India. Bangladesh is marginally better, and Sri Lanka is, once the civil war was over, a bit better. But in the highest levels of rape, the burning of women, is India. It's just horrific.
So what comes?
And they've got nothing to do with religion there. I mean, you know, this is traditional practice in India for hundreds of years.
No, absolutely horrific. But I wonder how in Afghanistan it is so easily possible to now bring back a Taliban regime. And, you know, you say they don't mistreat the women, but, you know, they send the women home. That's the first step.
Of course.
You know, to take them out of public life means that they will not even be able to call for help.
But look, there are two things on this. It's appalling, and that hopefully it will change with the women, you know, doing something themselves. But this would have been a bit different had some progressive groups in Afghanistan fought the occupation. The fact that the Taliban were the only resistance force, they now feel incredibly confident.
But were the progressives hoping that what they had with
the progressives completely capitulated to the occupation, just totally banking on Western power and hoping that this would change. But, you know, Western power did not do anything for the women in a large bulk of the country. It was showpieces, Potemkin villages in 3 or 4 cities.
It was a bit more than that. I mean, if you have female judges, for example, you can change a system over time. Yeah? That's not
well, 20 years is quite a long time to overhaul a system. I mean, there's a very fine piece by Anand Gopal in the New Yorker, which you should read, which just describes that the condition of women in most of the countryside didn't change at all.
I'm sure that it didn't change enough. Definitely, certainly not for me. But it's, I think it's very, very, very hard to change traditional structures. We are fighting for women's equality with 100 years of democracy in the European countries.
True, yeah. I think in Britain,
getting slightly better, we have to say, but it's not where we want it to be.
No, and women. I mean, in the Western world, I don't know so much about each different European country, but till the 1950s in Britain, women weren't allowed to have their own checkbooks.
Yeah, of course. They were not,
They're not allowed to have a bank account.
Yeah, and if you wanted a passport, you had to ask your husband, and so on and so forth. But to come back to Afghanistan, one of the glorious moments now, also in your book, when after 9/11, the American or the Western intervention came, did you for a moment at that point think that could be removing what the original idea was, removing the threat of Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda from this region?
Yeah, I think there was, I remember I was interviewed one week after the entry into Afghanistan on Canadian television and American radio. And I said, as far as I can see, this entire occupation, which the United States has organized, backed by all its allies, all it is a brutal war of revenge. And with me was Charles Krauthammer from the Washington Post arguing with me. He said, hell, Guy, what's wrong with that? But they were in the 9/11. I said, well, you can do it. That's what's wrong with it, and no one will tell you off. But stop building this image that this is going to be a great liberation. And he said, I never write that, which is true. And the Biden now, in pulling out the troops, actually said all this occupation was to get rid of Osama bin Laden. But okay, let's even accept that. I don't think they knew what they were going to do. If you're going to get rid of Osama bin Laden, you don't announce it. By the time American troops got there, bin Laden and his whole leadership had fled to Pakistan. So, didn't anyone predict that? How could they not know when people like me knew? Well,
you probably know more than most people about.
Well, this is probably true, but not more than the combined intelligence services of the United States.
Well, in the end, they found him and they killed him also, as we know, with the famous photos of everyone sitting in the situation room and watching it.
Like it's Netflix centers. It's Netflix style politics.
Terrible.
It was awful, but anyway,
so you thought from the beginning that this was
wrong,
was
going to,
and even the original idea to at least remove, sort of also to liberate maybe the region from the presence of radical Islamists that were sort of doing their own thing.
I didn't think that was going to work unless there was a very determined effort made to rebuild the country. In my opinion, it might have worked, though I doubt it. I never believed it really. But let's suppose they'd gone and bin Laden had already gone. What do you do then? The Taliban have been instructed by the Pakistani military intelligence, very intelligently, don't fight back. Let it happen. And so the Taliban didn't fight back for a few years. When they decided to fight back, the American and NATO had already been bombing villages, bombing, civilians, destroying villages, just like before. So anger was building in Afghanistan. This anger we never really saw in the Western media. But if you look at newspapers in Pakistan, it was reported there. And so the Taliban grew.
That was from what year on, you would think?
I would say that this started in 2005 and 2006.
Relatively early for our story here.
That the Taliban began to organize again. I mean, there's one very important event that took place, which was a conference of intelligence people, agents, in a very well-placed hotel in Pakistan. And suddenly the whole thing went up, killing, top intelligence agents from all the NATO countries who were there. And that for the first time, the Taliban spoke up since the occupation, saying we did it. And I know there were reports of people celebrating in both countries, because by this time, the Pashtuns in Pakistan had begun to be affected by non-stop bombing raids, by some Taliban fighters coming in, being chased by the Americans, Pakistani Pashtuns being killed, then by the American decision imposed on the Pakistanis to just clear all the areas on each side of the border, drive the population out. They're IDPs, internally displaced refugees, sent into camps. So once that happened, I was sure this was going to end very badly. But even in 2015, 5 years or 6 years ago, the Washington papers were published by top intelligence, US intelligence agents who'd interviewed everyone, and generals and agents and civil servants, said this war is unwinnable. The sooner we get out. Some of them said the sooner we get out, the better.
It took a long time. Do you think it would have still be possible for the allies to get out after the first stage and say, like, okay, we don't really have an objective here to stay forever and do whatever? Would that have been possible at that point, or were also the local
well, the same thing would have happened that
happened
now? No, I mean, the Taliban would have taken power. The rest of the tribes, the lesser tribes in Afghanistan, had thrown all their eggs into the American basket for fighting with the Northern Alliance. But what has changed is this, from the American intervention in 2001, is that many people who supported the intervention in the region, Pakistan never supported it, but they had to pretend. They kept the contacts, all their contacts with the Taliban. I remember Hugo Chavez telling me once in Venezuela, he had been to the non-aligned conference in Havana, and he said, I met your president. I said, you're my president. Why? He said, let's not joke. He said, General Musharraf, President Musharraf, the military dictator. And he came up to me and he said, Comandante Chavez, do you know what's wrong with you? You just attack the Americans publicly. You should learn from us. Defend them publicly, but then go and do what you like.
Well, I remember because I was Brussels correspondent in 2001, and we flew after 9/11 with Javier Solana, who was at the time the High Representative for Foreign Policies, and a group of other people. We flew to 7 different countries in the Middle East to support the building of this alliance to do the war on terror. And we went to Islamabad and got sort of the official approval also of the Pakistani government, and then on to Tehran and on to Saudi Arabia, and all that happened we were, we as a journalists, we were watching at that with amazement, because it was so clear that this was going, to a certain extent, it was in the interest of some of these regimes to sort of go against these more radical elements, whoever they were. It was also not so clear. But on the other hand, of course, it was just absurd to think that there would be an intervention, But
the other thing about the Arab elites and the leaderships is that they know they're totally dependent on the United States. Now, if you look at the Saudis and you look at the Gulf states, but despite that, especially within Saudi Arabia, even on an elite level, there are people who know they have no alternative, but that doesn't stop them hating the Americans.
Yeah.
And I was taken aback. A Saudi friend of mine, an academic who lives here, a few days after 9/11, she was here. She told me, I rang up to hope that everything was all right. They'd come from a very top family. And she said, I rang up to speak to my sister. And my niece answered the phone. So I said, we exchanged pleasantries. And I said, pass the phone to your mother. And she said, Aunt, you're ringing me after such a long time? Not a single word of congratulation?
Ooh.
And she said, I said, congratulations for what? She said, for what Brother Osama has done to these bastards.
Ooh, nice family.
Yeah, but also the CIA caught lots of princes on tape, Saudi princes from the royal family, laughing and joking, saying, God, who knows, Osama would have done it. Amazing what he's done, and celebrating.
No, of course. I mean, there's a lot of
and there was a lot of that in the Arab world.
But okay, so if we look now at our current situation, so Afghanistan's intervention of Western allies went even wronger maybe than the Soviet one at the time. What is the conclusion? If you look also now at the Ukrainian situation, we cannot put military forces anymore out. No parliament in the West would even agree to that.
But it won't work. The problem
But what is it what we can do? I mean, what shall we do?
I don't think the West really can do very much unless, look at its own state, Tessa. The West doesn't really provide a very good model on many levels of what can be done to these in these countries. What you really need, I've been saying this for many decades, that one thing all these countries need, Pakistan, Afghanistan, parts of Egypt, is a mega social transformation and structural reforms which provide what people want in the United States as well, a proper education system, a proper health system, and housing. Given the billions, the trillions they've spent on the Afghan war, had they provided that and actually said, okay, we don't trust these governments to do it, we know how corrupt they are, and we are setting up, I don't know what, a UN-sponsored or something else agency which will supervise all this and make sure that these things are done and built. It can be done. In Pakistan, there's a group of doctors, many of whom work in the United States. They take 3 months holiday each year and come and work free. They've set up a dozen hospitals completely free of charge for everyone. And if you go and look at these hospitals, a huge one in Karachi, there are queues which go for miles. And it's first come, first served. So people start queuing. There's a desperate need for that. When I was, for one of my books, I went just knocking on doors in Lahore and Karachi, talking to fisher folk, and I would get the women because the men were out. And they would say, come in, because I went with other women sometimes to help. And I would say, if I was to ask you, this was after 9/11, what would you like most in this world? Just tell me whatever it is. What are your dreams? Our children to be educated. And the cleverer ones used to say, our children to be educated in English as well. Because they saw
preferably in Oxford, like Malala in the end. Like Malala in the end.
Like Malala in the end. And and they said, apart from that, we want health clinics in each community. You know, elementary demands which are universal. Not a single one of the people that I interviewed, and they were not political people at all. It really was like getting an oral history, mentioned religion.
Yeah.
Well, they live in a Muslim country. They don't need to talk about Islam all the time.
It's also, if you interview the women, you might not get so much of the
men. Some of the men I interviewed, actually, I didn't like them too much, but I did interview. They did. They did sort of say, the women didn't say this, and the men, after my questions got there, said, "Oh, fate, fatalistic."
But you see, I mean, you're totally right, of course, that the countries where we are from now in Europe, the Western world order also is not such a successful concept, and also internally not. In this country, we're busy with Partygate, so where government, the prime minister can't even keep the rules for COVID pandemics that he set out himself. So it all is between ridiculous and horrific, actually, because, people need to actually get their job done and govern properly and provide proper health care for their populations here too. But still the question remains, we don't have to police the world, and the United States won't do that in any case anymore.
I don't agree with you. They will police the world.
Well, but they can't really do it on a level that they did before.
The Americans, their big complaint, the big way in which the United States is different from the Europeans is this, that all the European colonies, because of the time at which they developed capital and became imperialists, conquered large parts of the world and stayed there 60 years, 70 years, 100 years, whatever. And they still didn't change much, but that's how they kept control of these countries. I mean, the net result, of course, we can discuss, pretty horrific, but still, they did it. The United States has not done it like that traditionally. The way the American empire has grown is they will take a country very quickly, find an elite which collaborates with them, and then leave. That is how, and everywhere they look for these relays who can run the country on their behalf. And after 9/11, some foolish British historians started saying it's time to do what Britain did and occupy, and they were given jobs at Harvard and Yale. This as if this was a new idea, till people began to realize that that doesn't work either. And so lots of Americans privately will tell you, we made a huge mistake. We couldn't find a reliable force in Afghanistan to run the country. We got stuck in there. It's not the way we do things. We did it in the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was a disaster. Wherever we've tried to ape the European powers, it's not been good for us. So wherever they, Vietnam, they were chucked out. Korea, they divided. Afghanistan, they've been chucked out. It's not been a good model for them.
No, but so that's why I'm thinking it's probably not going to happen on that scale so soon. And then the question is still, there are things where we would be, at least I am, on the same level like American political, maybe politicians, but also thinkers would be, that you would want to see the option for democracy in countries where there is none. And then the question is how to do that.
Well, the question I'm now, if you look at what is happening to democracy in the West, if you look at American democracy, or most of the European countries now, what is it? It's basically two center parties, nominally left and nominally right, surrounded by some extreme right parties, and that is the option on offer.
But it's not about having a perfect system. I don't think we have a perfect system, but I would disagree with you slightly. And I would agree with you on the American situation to be very bleak, because they are sort of close to an ungovernable system now. But we also will see what develops in America, because there are also not only hopeless moments. And in Europe, I wouldn't agree with you completely, because we have seen, rise of populism, right-wing populism in the last years, and they are collapsing, including here now. And you will see what type of, if there's a civilized,
but you see, the choice
center,
is
left
this,
and right coming out of it. So that's not a complete, we are not standing in front of a total wreckage of democracy.
No, but I think if you look at what's happened to the West since the collapse of the Soviet Union, interestingly enough, and that there's a linkage there, that by and large, since that period, slowly and unevenly, there is less and less room for dissent, serious dissent, in the newspapers. If you look at the best newspapers, I used to think for a long time in Europe, were the German press. Very serious, very, prepared to argue with people. That has gone now. I mean,
why?
I don't know why. If you look at the feuilletons in Le Monde went down before the Germans. But if you look at Süddeutsche Zeitung or the Frankfurter Allgemein, the range of debate is very limited, and it's very limited between intellectuals supporting the existing parties.
Well, maybe they are also slightly
scared and it's getting worse, and television is the same. So young people, especially young people, between the ages, I would say 16 and 25, let's say, barely watch the television news. They don't read newspapers.
But they get news. They just get it from somewhere else. They just don't do what we did.
No,
they don't
but that's because they don't believe it. They don't trust.
I have the Guardian coming to the house still in paper, because I wanted my children to have a newspaper in the morning. And they just don't. And I see more and more myself that I already have read the Guardian on my mobile phone before I come to the kitchen.
But there is also another problem. That even if you look at the Guardian, a newspaper I wrote for regularly, semi-regularly from the 70s till 2 years ago.
Which one?
It has really become very bad on many, many issues.
Which one?
The Middle East, for instance, totally pro-Israel. Very few really harsh articles. And I sometimes say to New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian journalists, when I run into them, can't you just do one thing? Haaretz in Israel I don't agree with everything. I know what their politics are. But when they have Gideon Levy and Amira Haas, can't you just publish these articles and say these are published courtesy of an Israeli newspaper?
Yeah. No, they don't do it. Well, they have.
So in any case, I mean, the other thing.
We should also, Tariq, we have to ask if there are any questions, because we are running
Sorry,
out of time.
oh my God.
Already it was 2 minutes to 7. Sorry, we were so involved in our chat. Do we have any questions, Jutta?
Yes, so far there is one question in the Zoom chat, and it reads, would you say that Pakistan still backs the Taliban?
Is Pakistan still backing the Taliban is the question.
This is Pakistan's big victory. How could they not back people they've supported despite some differences between them? Yeah, they are. And Imran Khan, the president or the prime minister of Pakistan, only 2 days ago made a huge appeal for aid and funds and food to be shipped in, because the situation in Afghanistan is awful. There are people selling young children, selling them in the open market to feed the other members of the family. There's malnourishment. It's a semi-famine type situation for half the population. And what we now know is that for 20 years, most of the country's economy was basically supplied by the Western powers. 80% of the budgets were funded by the Western powers. The sanctions imposed, and even the United Nations Secretary General has said, don't punish the people of Afghanistan, for God's sake. Do something for them. And this is the position of the Pakistan government, which is sending in aid. They are. I mean, when the Taliban won, Imran said, this is a huge triumph and a victory against the United States. And the army then had to apologize to the Pentagon, saying he sometimes speaks without thinking. But that is the
thank
move.
you.
Yeah.
Sorry. There just came in another question, and it says, how will the situation for nuclear power change given its main ally in China and its other pretend ally, the USA, and that they are in competition?
How it for Pakistan, for how
for Pakistan,
how the situation for Pakistan will change with nuclear, in terms of nuclear weapons with China.
But they've had nuclear weapons for a long, long time now, you know, since the 80s. Pakistan has had nuclear weapons, so that's already 40 years old. So their position is, you know, changed at that time, that it was obvious that the country couldn't be taken over or invaded. I mean, because even though countries acquire relatively small countries acquire nuclear weapons, when they're told not to outside the West, they say, well, if France has nuclear weapons, who are they? They're a population of so many. If Britain carries American nuclear-armed submarines permanently, why shouldn't we? And unless you're opposed to nuclear weapons per se, it's very difficult to argue against that. And the nuclear countries also say they're a form of self-protection for us. And many people said to me, look, if Iraq had had nuclear weapons, the Americans wouldn't have been able to do what they did. So that is the world we live in. It's not what I favor, but that's how people think. I mean, I once made the mistake, not the mistake, but of publicly attacking nuclear weapons in India and Pakistan and saying we should have a nuclear-free South Asia. And I was attacked by everyone, Indians, Pakistanis, saying, well, how dare you say this? Do you say it about the West? And I said, I do. I do say it about the West as well. So then they shut up a bit. But it's a nuclear world on the term of weaponry. And, you know, with war, the increase in the experimentation in war technology is such that everyone wants to have the latest weapons, even non-nuclear. Look at drones, how quickly they've spread.
Would be a good idea maybe to have more denuclearization programs in the world now instead of more intervention. But was there another question now on chemical weapons with the Taliban? Did I see this correctly?
Not specifically on chemical weapons, but on the Taliban. And it says, do you think the Taliban have changed since they first came to power in 1996?
We covered this already. Have they changed, the Taliban? Is this a different Taliban?
We don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I think they must have changed somewhat because there are generational shifts. So even, you know, in different political parties. So it would be strange if this generational shift didn't impact on the new Taliban layers and the new Taliban leadership who have grown up in the world of the internet. Nothing is hidden from them. They can go and see what's going on, and they know perfectly well this is now unstoppable. So if their citizens have mobile telephones, if they have computers, or can have access to them, they can find out things that they couldn't find out when the first Taliban came to power, because technology has advanced so much. And the Taliban leaders are perfectly well aware of this.
Is this it? Do we have one more? We are already over time.
One more, maybe they just came in.
Okay.
One last, how could some of the Afghan national bank money frozen in the West be transferred to Afghanistan without favoring the government?
How can we unfreeze the money that was frozen from and bring it somehow with?
Yeah, well, the United Nations, unfortunately hasn't the power to do it because the United States is more powerful. But they've been appealing for this to happen. And most countries, the Europeans who met the Taliban in Oslo yesterday, were precisely discussing ways of unfreezing all this. In my opinion, they should do it unconditionally. That will have a much, much bigger impact than laying down conditions which they can't supervise. So they should just, having occupied a country for 20 years, the 300,000 strong puppet army which you were supplying with funds non-stop, a president which you put in, Ashraf Ghani, who fled the country in a helicopter, carrying millions and millions of dollars, and then you impose sanctions on that country. It's unacceptable behavior.
Yeah, but I mean, Tariq, on the other hand, we have a possibility to say we support Afghani population now with cash in order to buy food, which is sort of a humanitarian thing to do, which is also very important that we do this anyway. But unconditionally, maybe we don't have to do this because we could say that they have to treat women well enough to at least let them get educated. You can't tell a country to do everything, but they are not in a situation now where they have to.
So you say we'll only give you food if you transform your attitude to women.
Well,
and the women the Taliban can then ask, what the hell did you do for women for 20 years? The majority of women, the millions of women, what did you do?
Well, they can
and the answer is nothing.
No, but they can say a lot.
You sent a few NGOs, we made a few pretty pictures, we brought a few of their women in to say how good it's doing.
It was a little bit more than that. I mean,
I don't agree with that. I don't agree it was a little bit
some
more
women were working as judges.
But then why?
And that is better than having them just at home.
I think the life for women in Afghanistan is bad. But as I said earlier, I don't like the way this has been treated as blackmail. We're going to liberate women, Bush and Blair's wife said when they went. It was almost presented as a war for women's liberation, which is
let's
bullshit.
not get into all the mistakes that were done. The question is on the way forward now. As you say,
it will not be solved by the West using it as blackmail. That will not make the condition of women better. I'm just telling you that. It might do so for 6 months while they collect the money, but then it'll be back to normal. You have to have a more organic way of doing it. I don't know what that is, but the women in that country will have to do it. Well, it means it grows out of the society. In Pakistan, the condition for women is absolutely awful. And the Women's Action Forum, very nice people, very good people, my sister, her friends, others. But for the majority of women, they don't activate themselves. And that is the big problem. Had there been a Kurdish-style women's organization in Afghanistan fighting against NATO, things might have been a bit different. But they just accepted the Western umbrella.
Okay, but sort of in terms of how to deal with the Taliban now, that everything is basically lost and the West has not even a moral claim now to say, like, we did a great job, so please let us help.
Yeah, but
I mean, it's sort of, it's really, it's a dismal situation, but it's also really horrible to think that we just don't even make an effort to help now, but not only women, everyone who has been working against the Taliban, who is now on the
everyone, the way they look at it is everyone who has for 20 years been collaborating with the West. Yeah, it's a collaboration.
That's a really too simple way to
I'm
look
afraid not.
at
You know, if you live in that part of the world and you meet people regularly from it, who are not supplied by funds from the West and benefiting from NGOs, that is how most people see it. They benefited because they collaborated. But you have to see it like that, that people in whatever part of the world, most people don't like being occupied.
Well, that here I do agree with you. For sure, this is not a good idea to occupy. other
I'm just saying that blackmail shouldn't be used. We give the money to save people from starving, provided you, because it won't work, Tessa. If it worked, I would say, okay, but it's not going to work.
I mean,
it just becomes a sort of, you know, empty whinging moralism, which we've been listening to for 20 years.
No, but I would be interested in seeing what, for example, in Oslo, as you said, not a great record.
The NGO women were present there, pleading also at Oslo, not part of the Taliban. Please don't impose these sanctions, lift them.
Well, of course they will want to lift the sanctions. The question is if we have a conditional
I think it can't. You can't, I mean, learn some lessons from the past.
But it's not a military oppression, and it's not a kind of occupation to say like more money can be given if the schools are open for women. I mean, I think that would be quite.
Well, look, it's a model to think about. Let's say they open them for 7 months. Then what?
Then we again say the same thing.
Well, but you know, they have other ways of making money too. Once the country is recognized, they will have lots of money coming in from China, Russia, even Pakistan, possibly India. They don't need to be dependent on the West, and the heroin trade goes on.
They definitely don't need to. They don't need to be dependent on our little money that we give compared to others. And also, of course, it's not good to hand everything over to the drug market.
The other thing people say, are our women more special than the women in Saudi Arabia?
No, yes.
I'm just telling you, this is the closest ally of Britain and the United States.
It doesn't help us in this discussion now to say what went wrong in other parts also.
No, but it does, because you can't have double standards. In Saudi Arabia.
No, but take one standard for each situation. And we have to decide lots of things point by point. Well, now, after this disaster in Afghanistan, where really a lot of these civilians are hanging in a really deplorable situation, if it's from hunger or because they cannot go to work or to school.
Also because the Europeans don't want any more refugees. You go into a country, you occupy it for 20 years, and then you don't want the refugees. Every time Europe and America and NATO go to war, the condition should be by its own citizens, which it will never be, each war, let's take 1 million. Because after every single war, you have refugees.
Yes.
You know, they're swimming, dying in the channel, trying to swim from Europe to England.
But what I can say in conclusion of this talk is that I think Tariq will come with me to Ballhausplatz in Vienna, and we will demonstrate that together.
Yes.
That every intervention that our powers do, they will be also prepared to take the refugees that result from this.
Merkel took 1 million, and look what happened in Germany.
Yeah. Well,
big growth of the AfD.
Yeah, but she still sort of, you know, was a successful chancellor. In the end, it actually worked better than we thought at that moment.
I'm in favor of refugees being allowed. Obviously, I'm in favor of it. But if you don't want them on these numbers, then don't make war.
Well, yeah.
I mean, you know, the two are linked.
We come to the demonstration, Ballhausplatz, prepare. And liebe Freunde des Kreisky-Forums, liebe Freundinnen des Kreisky-Forums, dear friends and dear Tariq, thank you very much for being here tonight, even if we were only on Zoom and on Facebook and online in my living room.
It's better than not to do it.
It's better than not to do it. Thank you very much and have a good night.
Thank you for listening.